All right, we will go ahead and get started with the webinar today. I am Nathan Johanning. I'm an extension educator in local food systems and small farms working with the University of Illinois Extension. My office is actually located in Murfreesboro, Illinois, which is far southern Illinois, for those of you that aren't familiar with that. And also assisting me today will be Bronwyn Ailey. Bronwyn, if you want to say hello if you're around. She will be moderating and helping field questions and other things.
Good afternoon, everybody.
All right, so to start off with, just the basic concepts of potatoes and how they grow. For one thing, just to get everyone on the same page, potatoes are a tuber, which is a modified stem, not a root. This is a common misconception, and this is one of the main differences between a white potato or Irish potato and a sweet potato, as a sweet potato actually is a root and a white or Irish potato is actually a tuber. So, and a little bit about how they grow. New potatoes form from they're typically grown based off of a seed piece, and we'll talk more about this later. New potatoes form off of the stem, not off of roots. So commonly we tend to think of potatoes forming off of roots, but really it's off of the stem. And this diagram here gives a really good example of that. You can see where you have the stolons coming off of the main stem, and that gives rise to new, what we call daughter tubers, or the new tubers that are produced. And so because of that, one thing, and we'll talk about a little bit, is, as you can see, the mother tuber, as listed on there, is actually can somewhat determine the depth of the other potatoes that you will be harvesting. So generally speaking, you will have no new tubers much below the level at which you plant the original seed piece. So that's one thing that's really important to know about potatoes and how they grow. All right, so from there's all kinds of things we need to consider with regards to production, things about your site, how you're going to produce, when you're going to plant, soil fertility, varieties, pest management, and harvest and storage. So, starting off with site selection and soils. You want ideally a well-drained soil. And this is one way to look at that would be something that does not hold surface water for more than 24 hours. So if you have a heavy rainfall event and it typically will hold water more than 24 hours a day later, then that's one indication it's probably not a good site. Ideally, we look for a sand or sandy loam soil is where potatoes tend to do best. However, if many of you are here in the Midwest, you know that that's not necessarily our predominant soil type unless you happen to be in a specific area or river bottom or things like that. But many of our typical Midwestern soils, our loams or silt loams or clay loam soils, are also fairly well adapted at raising potatoes as well. And there's some varieties that do perform very well in this climate and soils. So typically you also do not want to plant directly into new ground, especially if there has been grass or pasture in it in the recent past. The main reason is you can have soil insects, especially wireworms, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, that can be extremely problematic. And they tend to feed on grass roots and other things, so therefore it's always best if you can take a new area, establish it, and rotate a few other crops through, and then get it into production, and then rotate potatoes to it, rather than, say, plowing under a new area of sod and directly planting potatoes the next year. Also, you always want to utilize around a 3 to 5 year crop rotation as best you can, and within that rotation, avoid other solanaceous crops. So that would be things such as tomato, pepper, eggplant, also includes tobacco, and some weeds. So things like some of the nightshade, eastern black nightshade and things like that are also in the solanaceous family. So make sure to do your best to avoid avoid having those in the area in the other rotational years. Otherwise, you can lose some of that benefit of crop rotation. All right, next, talking a little bit about soil fertility. So one of the things that's probably most important is the soil pH. Ideally, you want to have it somewhere around the 5.6 to 6.0 range. There's two things we'll talk about here that we're trying to balance. The first being that you have below 5.6, you have decreased nutrient availability, and you want to do your best to manage it so that way the plant's getting the maximizing the nutrients. When you get much above 6, especially above 6.5, nutrients become unavailable. However, the biggest thing is you have an increased incidence of scab in potatoes. Scab is uh, a defect on the skin of the potato, which of course renders it to be non-marketable, and so therefore it's one thing that you want to avoid, and pH is very critical of the soil in order to help manage that. So therefore we tend to keep potatoes below 6, so that way we are managing and not having issues with scab. A note on that: if you have not had issues with scab and you're around that 6.0 range, then you'll probably be fine. In some cases, you will see in literature it recommending you actually have the pH down as low as 5 or 5.5. If you have large issues with potato scab, then I would consider going on the lower end of the pH, or maybe even a little bit below 5.6, knowing that you can benefit from having reduced scab even if you maybe aren't completely maximizing nutrient uptake. So that's one of the crucial points of how pH is critical. Also, you want to maintain around 150 to 200 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre over a year. You want to put about 2/3 of that down at planting, and then another third of that mid-season around side dress, say ahead of a cultivation. For phosphorus and potassium, generally speaking, about 120 pounds of actual either P2O5 for phosphorus or potassium, the K2O, would be an average kind of maintenance amount. And this is based off of having a basic soil test that would be what we would call kind of adequate levels, around 50 pounds of phosphorus and 300 pounds of potassium. And I'll talk more about this, but that's some general recommendations. But if you visit the University of Kentucky Vegetable Production Guide, which is their ID 36, they have some really great specific recommendations for phosphorus and potassium based off of various soil test ranges. And I'll give you the link for that at the end, so you can go there to tailor your specific P and K needs directly off of your soil test results. So next is, how are you going to plant? There are many different planting methods of varying kinds that are all tend to be fairly effective. You can plant in the soil and of course cover with soil. You can cover with straw only. You can cover with both. You can cover with soil and then cover straw on top of it. You can plant into buckets. There's an example here. You can plant, some are planting into wire cages that are lined with straw and have soil in them. You can plant into, I think I've even seen old tires stacked up and have potatoes planted inside them. There's all kinds of things. If you look online, you can find different ways to produce potatoes. In this case, what I'm focusing on this presentation is means that you would use to produce as a small farmer's market or commercial grower. So even though some of these ways of production can be really interesting, a lot of times they're not viable to have all those supplies if you have general field soil available and good field conditions. So those are ways, and there's many of them are viable. You can certainly produce potatoes, but we're going to focus on the main production methods you would need as a small commercial scale grower. So starting off with, you're going to plant what we call seed potatoes. So this is, as I kind of mentioned, it's not truly a seed, but it's rather a cut portion of a potato. So you're going to want to buy certified seed potatoes. That means you're certified and to be disease free. You can save potatoes from one year to another. However, over time, it's best to renew that planting stock about every 3 years or so, because you can get some diseases that build up in there if you continually save seed from year to year. Um, so that's just one thing to consider. You don't always have to. Depends on where you're at. We'll talk about seed sources, whether it's more economical to buy seed or to maybe save seed. You'll also be planting usually around a 2 to 4 ounce seed piece. So there's two ways you can do that. You can buy a bag of seed potatoes and cut them, or in some cases, especially on a commercial scale, if you're ordering larger quantities, you can find what they call B grade seed. So what this is these are small, basically inch to inch and 7/8 diameter potatoes. In this case, they can be planted directly. You don't have to cut them. It does save a lot of time. However, in some cases they're not readily accessible, especially on a small scale, and small markets you don't necessarily see them available, so you may not be able to get access to them. So I would say most commonly for most small growers, you're going to be cutting potatoes to make seed pieces. All right, so you have a potato. What are you going to do with it to get that seed piece? To start off with, you're going to cut it into approximately around, like say, 2 or a little bit bigger size, ounce size piece, ensuring that you have at least one eye on each piece. And you can see from the illustrations I have below, you have a potato here. In this case, we have, I would say, just a nice average sized, kind of smaller baking potato. You can see one of the eyes is already starting to sprout. But note, there's also eyes. You can, if you look closely on other portions, not just that one sprout. Usually, you'll see eyes fairly well spread across the tuber. You can see then, in this case, I decided that this one I could make 4 pieces out of. Cut it into 4 pieces, and then in the end you see I have at least one eye. Sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 depending on how they're distributed. It takes a little bit of a time to kind of develop your vision to be able to see the eyes on the potato, especially some of the eyes that are more dormant. However, once you get through a bag or 2 of potatoes, you tend to get pretty quick at determining which way you're going to make a cut. All right, next, planting. So you want to start off with making sure you have a good soil bed prepared. You want to remove any excess residue and debris as best you can, so you have a fairly good bed to work with. You want to work the soil as deep as the hills will be high, and we'll talk about that more here in just a second. So your hill height at first, you want to be relatively shallow, so just a few inches at planting to promote rapid emergence. And then later in the season, by the end, you want to have anywhere from a 6 to 10 inch tall hill by the end of the season. So you're probably wanting to work the soil somewhere 6 to 10 inches deep, or at least 6 to 8 inches deep for sure. So that way you have the soil adequately worked, so you can get good growth of new potato tubers. You're going to plant into a shallow furrow or trench, and then, as I said, cover with 2 to 3 inches of soil. This goes back to the initial slide I had with talking about kind of the biology of the potato. You can plant potatoes deeper, and some people you may very well have a chance to have had opportunity to experience, planting them even, maybe 6 or 8 or more inches deep, and that's fine. However, in my experience, since the deeper you plant them, the deeper your potatoes are. That means the more digging you have to do whenever you have to harvest. So generally, we try to plant them fairly shallowly, and then keep them covered and continue to form a ridge or bed over the top of them to maintain growth of those new tubers. Plants will usually emerge around 2 to 4 weeks. It depends on the soil temperature. 2 weeks is probably about the earliest that I've ever seen potatoes come up. However, I have in some cases in cool springs, especially if it's fairly wet, I have seen it take as long as almost a month before you really see emergence. All right, next, planting date. So usually I would say, and this is for say Southern Illinois and other similar climates, probably late March to April is probably the best time to plant. Ideally, usually I shoot for maybe the very, very end of March, and I'm happy with somewhere in like the first couple weeks of April. You want to know that planting into cold, wet soils can lead to seed piece decay. I know many people that swear by planting their potatoes on St. Patrick's Day, and that can be the case, and it certainly can be successful, but overall, potatoes really are a warm season crop. Um, so therefore, you you don't gain a lot by planting them extra early. If anything, you tend to get more issues with seed piece decay just because you're putting them out there. Generally, the soils are cooler earlier. On a good year, it might not be an issue, but should we get a very wet, cold, rainy late March or April, that can really cause a lot of issues and to not have a good stand. So typically speaking, especially first part of April in this area is really ideal for planting. Plant spacing, it varies. A lot of it, as far as the between row spacing, varies on your equipment. We'll talk a little bit about, and you'll see some pictures of various equipment that we will encounter and use. So whatever fits the bill for you, whether it be some cases it can even be less than 36 inches, maybe it's 30 inches if that's how your equipment is spaced. But 36 to 42 inches is kind of a typical width between rows, and within the row around 8 to 12 inches between plants. Just as a general rule, and this is different for each variety, will have one of the you will have larger tubers whenever you have the plants spaced more further apart, whereas the more tightly spaced you have the plants, you'll tend to get a little bit smaller tubers. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit in the marketing section about maybe how you want to market those and what might be best for your environment. And just on average, it takes around 100 pounds of seed potatoes for around 1,000 feet of row, and that's around 1,300 pounds per acre, and that's just a rough estimation on 38-inch rows and 12-inch within row spacing. So that's something that obviously will vary. It depends on the quality of your seed. It depends on your skills as far as cutting them and how large or small you make your seed pieces. There's a lot of variability in that, but that's just at least an initial guideline, and there's some other resources out there that can help to guide you with the perspective of how much seed you need to order for a given area. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is variety selection. So there's all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors of potatoes. So there's really the world's a plenty of so many different varieties, far more than just the standard things you may be accustomed to seeing in the supermarket. So I'm going to go through a few slides here that have some pictures of some varieties, and then I'll also give a listing, and we'll talk a little bit about some yields of some of these varieties. And know that there are easily, dozens and dozens of varieties. So this is just a small taste of a few varieties that are out there. So first is Kennebec, which you can see here on the left. Kennebec is probably one of the staple white-skinned, white-flesh varieties. It has good yield. You can see that it has fairly uniform shape and size. Produces some very nice sized tubers. Um, Really good eating quality and really good storage ability. It stores very well, doesn't sprout nearly as easily as some do. Beside it, we have red Pontiac. It's a red-skinned and white flesh potato. Very common. These are both ones you can usually readily find a lot of seed sources very easily. All right, next we have on the top left we have Corolla. This is more of a specialty potato. This is a yellow skinned, yellow flesh. You can see it has a very bright yellow flesh from this picture. Really a little bit smaller than maybe the previous two we mentioned, but it has a really good eating quality. Next to that, we have Yukon Gold. That's probably one of the ones that's gotten the most press lately, and it is a really good yellow-skinned, yellow flesh potato. Very flaky, great for baking, makes some really nice mashed potatoes, and it is a fairly good yielder. Also has a very nice round shape and size. So especially for baking potatoes, um, it tends to produce a lot of really just nice, round, uniform tubers. So especially when you look at marketability, has a really good potential. Another more specialty variety on the bottom left is Durango. It is a red-skinned and white flesh potato, and unfortunately in these pictures we didn't have the potatoes washed up. If you had washed them, you can kind of tell in comparison um, to Desiree next to it. Um, Durango has an extremely bright red flesh. I really wished I had a picture of one wash. It's definitely something to behold. It would be a great accent for use in in any kind of potato dish, especially where you're not going to be peeling it. Desiree, on the next to that, is also a red skin, white flesh. It's more of a kind of a pinkish color, not nearly as dark as Durango. And next we get into some specialty types. In this case, we have all blue at the top, so this is a blue or purple skinned with a blue or purple flesh to it. You can tell these potatoes have a little smaller tubers, but have a pretty decent size, tend to be a little bit elongated. Next we have Austrian Crescent. Austrian Crescent is a fingerling potato, so it is one of the very long, slender potatoes. It is a yellow skin, yellow fleshed. And also another one would be Russian Banana. That's a fingerling. It's also yellow skinned and fleshed. As you can see, not quite as bright yellow as the Austrian Crescent. And then the last one here that I have is German Butterball. This is a small, fairly round potato, yellow skinned and yellow fleshed. Great eating quality as you would maybe a Yukon Gold, but it is nicer if you're looking for a small, very round, yellow skinned potato. All right, I know we have just a couple of questions here. I just want to pull away for a second. You're talking about soil pH being a little over 7. I would say in your situation, it would probably be best to reduce that with using some elemental sulfur. Would be the best way to reduce it, although you would probably not be able to reduce it far enough to plant into your soils this year. And you can plant at a pH of 7, but just know that you probably will have a greater tendency for scab, and it would be more ideal to have your pH a little bit lower. And we can talk more specifically, and my contact information will be up for specific recommendations on making those pH adjustments. Talking about organic growing and growing potatoes indoors, to use during as seed for the summer. You can actually, for most of these, you can keep seed without having to grow them indoors over the winter. And we can talk about that a little bit more. We'll talk about storage conditions. Usually, if you harvest them and put them into, say, something like a cooler or any cold storage type environment, you can, most varieties, easily keep them from, say, a summer harvest until planting the next year. So you don't necessarily have to try to continue to keep them growing to maintain a seed stock supply. All right, well, we will continue on here. So we talked about those various varieties, and here's just a few notes on the performance of those. And I have this listed. The first three columns are the marketable and cull yields, and also a total yield, and those are just listed in pounds per 100 foot of row. You can use that to help give you some gauge, especially on a small scale. I didn't want to put it per acre. 100-foot row is a good scale for most of you to probably understand and relate to. As you can see, on some of the top of our list, Kennebec is a high yielder, as I mentioned. Also, Red Pontiac does fairly well, less than Kennebec. Yukon Gold, as you can see, is also up there. And Desiree is another one that is fairly good performance. So you can see overall we have pretty good yields. If you go down to notice, especially as to some of the specialty potatoes, the all blue, Austrian crescent, and Russian banana, a lot of times you may see yield numbers and maybe pounds per acre that are maybe a little bit lower, but remember, on a lot of these specialty potatoes you can command a little greater price on them because they are a specialty, and some of the fingerling potatoes don't yield the same quantity as far as the poundage as what some of the larger baking types do. So there is a little bit of a trade-off there on some of those, but generally speaking, there are some really good yielding varieties for really all of your situations, environments, and varieties of colors and things like that. Also, if you look at the additional column, you'll see we have marketable ounces per tuber. So this is just to give you a estimation of your average marketable tuber size. So if you look here, that would be the fourth data column as we're working our way towards the right. You can see, Kennebec is one of the top. Kennebec and Yukon Gold are around that 5 ounces per tuber on average. And however, you see as you get down to things like the all blue Austrian crescent, Russian banana, and things like that, we have a lot smaller tubers, and so that's something to consider, and as to what your market wants. If you're wanting to sell a larger baking potato, then that's there you can see some of the varieties that produce more consistently larger tubers. However, if you're looking for maybe a specialty market or maybe a farmer's market where people are looking for maybe smaller potatoes, they can use whole or other things. You can see we have some that have around that 3 ounce or a little smaller size, which can fit that niche pretty well. And then the quality column, this is just a overall rating that we gave them on the in the trial, as far as 10 being high and 0 being the lowest. It's just an average of how productive were they, how many culls did they have, did they have a good smooth surface, were they gnarled or misshapen or other things like that. So you can overall see most of them did perform fairly well. All right, and I see there is a question about planting under plastic mulch. That's one thing that that is becoming fairly popular, especially as using a plastic mulch for a second crop, say after another primary crop was the year before. And actually I'll hit on that a little bit here in just a couple slides when we start talking about some other production methods. So this is just kind of a summary statement of some recommended varieties. There's a few on here that we did not have pictures of, that weren't in that specialty potato trial I did a few years ago. So we can see on the white skinned we have Kennebec. Also there's Superior. Dakota Pearl is another one that is a good performer. The yellow skinned Yukon Gold and Cuca Gold, those are both some really good yellow skinned, yellow fleshed. Red skinned, we already talked about Red Pontiac. Red Lesotho is another one that I think shows a lot of promise and is a really good one for producing nice size, good yields. And there's also Red Norland, which is another red skinned, white flesh variety. Durango, which I already mentioned. The specialty types, we have Russian banana, which is a fingerling, French fingerling, which is another heirloom fingerling potato. We talked about Austrian crescent, and then all blue is another one. And there are many, many other varieties, especially on some of the different shapes and colors. This is just a little sampling. So if you're interested in some of the, especially the specialty types, I would encourage you to do some trialing maybe on your own and order some seed stock of various ones and see which ones you like and which ones especially fit the markets that you may have. All right, on to seed sources. Probably for most people, at least to get started, just utilizing things like local farm stores or garden centers can be your best place to get a hold of seed stock. Many varieties, especially things like Kennebec, Yukon Gold, Red Pontiac, occasionally Red Lesotho, Superior, those are ones that tend to be easily found at some local stores. Most commonly, not always, but if you see a white potato in a market situation like that, you're probably looking at a Kennebec, and usually they should have a seed bag around somewhere that would tell you for sure. Yukon Gold is usually always the yellow one, and Red Pontiac tends to be a favorite for the redskin. A couple other places to look, and this is not an extensive list. One thing would be Hummert Seed and Supply. They're located in St. Joseph, Missouri. They are a seed company that actually does handle potatoes. If you've looked, not all seed companies handle potatoes and stock potatoes. Also, Potato Garden. This is a place out in Colorado. It's formerly known as Milk Ranch Specialty Potatoes, but they specialize in many of your unique types, and that's actually where some of the seed stock came for that specialty potato trials. So things like Durango and German Butterball and Corolla, those all came from Milk Ranch, which is now Potato Garden. They had, and I just did a check on this yesterday, they have over I think it was 60 or 70 different potato varieties, from the blues and purples, fingerlings, small rounds, to your baking potatoes. They have a very, very extensive list of different offerings and varieties available. And also have Johnny's Selected Seeds. That's another seed company, but they also do handle potatoes as well. So, and there's many more. So this is not a specific endorsement, and I'm sure some of you maybe have other places that you get seed from, but those are, if you have no other ideas, here's at least a few places to give you a few starts. One other note on Potato Garden. Potato Garden, if you're interested, they do have naturally grown seed stock and seed potatoes. They are not certified organic, but if you look into their website, they do abide by the same principles for the most part as the organic standards. So that's one option if you're looking for that as a quality in making a selection on your potatoes. That might be especially a good way to go. One thing to note, and this is maybe one of the reasons why um, you don't find potatoes on order from every company, that you have to pay to ship them, and they are not light. So we talked about, you saw, was it 1,300 pounds of potatoes for an acre? That's not something you're necessarily going to drop in UPS. Most of the time, if you're going to order very many, you're probably going to be on a larger scale, ordering like a pallet full that's going to come truck shipped. So this is a really good opportunity to collaborate with some of your local growers to order larger quantities. That's probably one of the ways that I know local growers down here in my area will get together on various things, including this, and they'll put together to maybe get anywhere from maybe just one pallet full, or in some cases maybe even a truckload on larger farms. So work together. Just to help spread that load, because there are some really good things out there other than what you can maybe find locally, but it sometimes can be a pain to try to get them to you if you're not near a production company. All right, so now that's kind of some of the basics is getting started. Now we're going to kind of walk our way through the growing season. So the first thing, cultivation and hilling is fairly important in potatoes, especially the hilling. We talked about at the end of the season, you want to have a 6 to 10 inch hill over the potatoes. So what this does is this is promoting new stolons and tuber formation along the stem. So you're planting your seed piece from looking at thinking of our original diagram, and as that stem grows up, you're getting stolons that are growing off. So you want to keep soil mounded up and keep a hill around that plant, so that way you're getting new tubers to form. Also, you're covering up your developing tubers and excluding light. And if you aren't familiar with it, if you leave some potatoes out in the sun for a month, or in the light for a month or so, or even a couple weeks, you will see them start to turn green. This can happen in the field very often as well. So that's another reason to make sure you keep a good hill over your potatoes, so that way you are keeping them in the dark and you are not getting greening of those tubers. And also, of course, cultivation and hilling provides weed control as you go through the field. I always tell you, though, remember that anytime you're working the ground, you are exposing new weed seeds. So after you cultivate or hill, you will tend to get a flush of weeds come up, especially after that first rainfall. So now we're going to talk a little bit about different pests and some management tactics. First of all, for weeds, they can be extremely problematic. So you want to start clean and stay clean. Uh, Use some burn down and residual herbicides, or weed control timings for keeping the weeds down. Things like a burn down after planting but before crop emergence. So that we talked about, it takes 2 to 4 weeks for those tubers to emerge. If you are a good crop scout and after you plant, hopefully you get a rain and you get maybe a flush of very small weeds, that's an ideal opportunity to come out with a burn down herbicide, which could be something like a Roundup or Gramoxone. In a organic situation, there's horticultural vinegar. There's also flaming is also very commonly used at this timing. Those are all different things that you can do to maintain completely free of weeds early in the season, and that gives your potato plant a chance to get ahead of other competitors. And later on in the season, there are some post-directed sprays and other residual applications you can make that will help to keep weeds down. Grass herbicides can be very important. There's some synthetic products that do a really good job of controlling grasses, so you shouldn't ever have to be fighting them We just talked about cultivation and also mulches. So talking about black plastic mulch, I won't go into a great deal of detail just because we only have an hour to talk about overall production, but black plastic can be utilized. It's good for getting earlier production. It also provides some weed management as well. There can be drawbacks, especially with as far as some of our four-legged pests that like to also live under plastic mulches. They also like to live under straw as well. But black plastic can be utilized, especially to get an early start. Also, straw can be utilized, and one of the production methods, especially in the older generations, was often to plant potatoes and put a small hill over them, and then to straw with around a foot thick layer of straw over the entire field, and those tubers will send up shoots through the straw, and it will keep them protected, and for the most part keep the light out as long as you have the straw thick enough, and you will get lots of tubers forming on the surface of the soil as you pull that straw back. The downside is mice and voles love to live in straw, and they also love to eat potatoes. So therefore, that is one drawback. And also, you have to buy or bale the straw. You have to put it on there, and you have to remove it before you can harvest. So there's a little extra labor in that as well. All right, kind of getting back on to weed management. Managing weeds when they are small is crucial. It'll make your life easier, and most of the things that we are using, whether it be a hoe or a herbicide or a cultivator, are going to do better on a small weed versus a large weed. And always make sure you're managing weeds and other rotational crops, so that way you're keeping your weed populations as low as possible. All right, managing grass weeds. Here, there are some good herbicide options available, as I mentioned. Spray grasses whenever they're 4 inches tall or less for the greatest effectiveness. Don't wait until they grow up, until they get extremely tall, and then try to take them down. Make sure you follow any labeled adjuvant recommendations. So this would be adding things like oils or surfactants to maintain their effectiveness. That can greatly determine how effective those products are. And also watch out for PHIs, which is pre-harvest intervals. And you can look up all that information in some of the production guides. So that tells you how far ahead of harvest you have to be when you can make that application, or how many days after application you have to wait to harvest. Grasses can be very competitive, so do use these products. Things such as the active ingredient clethodim, which is Select Max or Arrow is a trade name. Also Post is another one that is labeled. And refer to some of the production guides I'll give you links to later for more details. All right, next, managing yellow nutsedge. And I only point this weed out specifically because it is one of very specific importance to potato production. So yellow nutsedge is a very significant pest in potatoes. It has the ability to actually root through potato tubers, and that greatly decreases your tuber quality and marketability. So you can see the picture I have here that I pulled out of one of the a field a couple years ago, and that's a yellow nutsedge plant. Sedges have a triangular stem, very, very shiny, glossy leaves. And that, you can see, has rooted right into that potato, and it comes out the other side. And if I had a picture of it split open, you could follow that brown root going right through that potato. And nothing ruins a good baked potato like a yellow nutsedge root running right through the middle of it when you cut it open. And oftentimes, once you get, this one is obviously easy to detect, but it can be a very, very small mark on the outside that as you're quickly sorting through potatoes, you may not necessarily notice before it goes out to a consumer. So it's better to not even have this as an issue than to try to have to sort it out, or to risk the chance of someone getting a hold of one of those that doesn't have a appreciation for it. Also, yellow nutsedge is an indicator of poorly drained soils, which potatoes do not perform well in anyhow. You tend to get lots of disease issues, and tuber rots and things like that. So overall, if you have a great deal of yellow nutsedge there, that probably means you should pick a different space to produce potatoes in anyhow for good production. So just a couple quick notes on do's and don'ts for managing yellow nutsedge. Things that are effective. Planting into well-drained soils. You really don't notice yellow nutsedge very much in well-drained conditions. There's some various herbicides listed here, things like dual magnum, which is a pre-emergence residual herbicide, which can be used in potatoes. When weeds are small, Roundup or Gramoxone can be very effective. The herbicide Sandia is also very effective. However, it's not labeled for use, and you can't use it in potatoes. You can use it in that production area in rotational crops. Maybe in other years, it's labeled in things like that product can be used in things like corn or pumpkins. However, do watch your replant interval and be wary of potential carryover with that. It can be done, but it's just something that you should consider before you use that in your rotation. Practices that are not, or I say not very effective on managing it. Poorly drained soils. It's going to be a problem. Don't even try it. Applying a grass herbicide. This is probably one of the least, or if at all, not effective management tactics. Yellow nutsedge is indeed a sedge, not a grass, and because of that, all of the herbicides we have that are labeled for grass do not have any effectiveness whatsoever on yellow nutsedge. So that's one thing that will not get you very far. Mulches, if applied thick enough, mulches can provide some suppression. Straw can. However, if you're strawing on a very poorly drained soil with yellow nutsedge, your potatoes are probably going to stay very wet, which could lead to other issues. But both straw and black plastic, yellow nutsedge, just like a potato can work its way up through there, yellow nutsedge has a way of growing up through black plastic and also straw. So that isn't always a complete answer. And Roundup tends to be not very effective, especially on mature plants. It works fairly well when they're young, but not when they're mature. So here's just a quick weed management overview when you're talking about how to approach the season for potatoes. So you till and plant your potatoes prior to emergence. Around 2 to 3 weeks after planting, you can apply some kind of a burn down product. You could use flaming or something like that. You can also include some residual herbicides. And then later, after you hill, you can go back through and apply another residual herbicide as one option to prevent any future weed flushes. Note you don't want to do this before hilling because in that case, for most of these products, you're going to apply it and then you're potentially going to break that herbicide barrier by going through and hilling. So you want to do that afterwards. And then after hilling, you can go back if you have grass weeds that have escaped and apply something like your Select Max or Post to help manage grass weeds. All right, we're just quickly going to talk about some common insect problems. Foliar feeding insects, things like Colorado potato beetle, grasshoppers, and flea beetles can be really bad at defoliating potato plants, subsequently reducing their yield potential. Soil insects that can be problematic. Wireworm. This would be the this would be the critter that you see here in the pictures to the right. You do have, it's a small kind of brownish orangish colored larva that does feed, and you can see there as the suspect in hand is caught red-handed in the middle of a potato tuber. So they make small holes, ruin the surface, and therefore decrease your marketability of that tuber. Things such as white grubs and other larvae that are in the soil also can feed on potato tubers and basically cause imprints in the depressions in the skin, not necessarily always causing rot, but they do limit the quality and marketability. So some overall management options, crop rotation, and then for many of these insecticide treatments is the best. And quickly, Mike, your question about frequent hilling to control weeds. You can use frequent hilling, and that's one tactic. My overall season example was kind of a illustration of how to maybe incorporate some herbicides into that. One thing to note is when the soil conditions aren't ideal, you tend to have issues maybe getting out in the field in a timely basis, especially if you have a soil that's not so sandy and you can't just go out and work it at any point in time. And there's also one concern. We like to try to not over-till our soils and completely ruin the soil structure. So sometimes it's nice to be able to rely on a few other methods for controlling weeds, so we're not constantly tilling and working that soil just from a soil conservation standpoint. But certainly in hilling, some cases you will hill as many, maybe as few as maybe one time or two times throughout the season, but it may be as much in some cases as three or four or more. So usually probably around 2 to 3 is what I try to do, depending on the year and how things work. As Next question about how's best to sprout a potato eye. The best way, if you have bought in seed potatoes, is to keep them at a modest temperature, maybe around 50 or 60 degrees for a couple weeks ahead of planting or ahead of the time that you're wanting to cut them. Um, uh, whenever you um, Whenever you do that, the potatoes typically have been in cold storage, so by giving them some modest temperatures, it promotes their growth and breaking of dormancy. However, one thing I will note that I did not put in my presentation, if you go and buy a potato from the store, many of the potatoes that you buy in the store are actually treated to inhibit with a growth regulator, to a natural growth regulator, to help um, basically help prevent sprouting. Because whenever you have potatoes sprout, then you have the potato tuber starts to go down a little bit, and you tend to have a decrease in the quality. So therefore, for marketing purposes, for table stock, we don't want them to sprout. So you can have some great challenges trying to get a potato from the store to sprout and produce from. So just a few things to think about. All right, we'll continue on here, and we'll catch up with a few questions here a little bit later. Common disease problems, just in general, you can get some seed piece diseases. Things like fusarium can get in and cause seed piece rots, and I mentioned this before. Proper curing of seed pieces. So whenever you cut them, mentioned earlier, you want to cut them at least 5 to maybe 10 days ahead of planting, so that way they are going to cure, and that way that surface will tuberize, and it will heal over. If you immediately plant that very moist, freshly cut surface, it's just an invitation to have some of these rots, especially whenever you have very wet conditions after planting. On a dry year, oftentimes it's not a problem, but in wet conditions, it can really promote some of these seed rots. There's also a fusarium can affect tubers, and also we talked some about potato scab, which can deface the outside skin of the potatoes, reducing the marketability. On leaf diseases, early blight and late blight, which are also some things we tend to find in other solanaceous crops like tomatoes, those are also can be very problematic, and you can use some foliar fungicide treatments to help with those as well. Other pests. This is probably one of my favorite moments out in the potato patch one day after having many vole-ridden potato tubers. Mice and voles, especially if you are using straw, can be a very big deal. Even in storage, sometimes mice can be a problem. So therefore, at a certain point, after you see, a multitude of potatoes that as soon as you pick it up, you realize the underside has been hollowed out like uh, hollowed out completely, and you have this shell of a potato left. You soon grow to have a fond appreciation for these small little critters that can sometimes roam about your field and cause you some yield reduction, I suppose I would say. So, harvesting. New tubers generally will be set anytime after bloom. However, yields would be the greatest at full maturity whenever the plants actually die down. New potatoes, which you see marketed often, are not any specific variety that's often asked. It's just simply very young potatoes. So that way you're harvesting them when the skin is still very soft and the potato tubers are very young. And as I said, they do have a very delicate skin, so make sure when you're harvesting new potatoes, you're doing it very carefully. A lot of times for a fresh market, you're probably going to be wanting to do this by hand, so that way you don't have any injury to the skin. Next, on harvest, your main harvest, you're going to do that when the vines begin to die down, and at this time, you're going to be nearing maturity. The skin is set or it toughens up so the tubers are more durable to handling. So that's why we tend to, for main season harvest, we have better durability, especially for coming in with equipment to help us with the harvest. You can use a desiccant if you need to basically take down any weeds that may be there, and also to aid in getting all of the vines to die off, so that way you don't have vines. Say if you go through with a middle buster plow, you're not getting caught up on lots of vines and things, and that would be used about 1 to 3 weeks prior to harvest. And you can look to some of our resources here at the end for recommendations on products. You can do that. Also, you can mow if you have a small mower that you can, maybe a tractor mower that you can drive through the rows and set it so it runs and the blades run just right over the top of the hills. That's a perfect way to help remove some of the vines and maybe a few potential weeds that might be out there. All right, how to harvest. A lot of times we will harvest by hand in some cases, and sometimes we have some aids to help us with that. Some things you might see, some harvesters, things like a middle buster plow, which is that center photo. You can see this is a single bottom middle buster that basically throws soil to each side, and it has some fins on the back of it. As you can kind of see there, that what that does is that helps to allow the tubers to fall through fairly close to the top of the ground without having them all completely buried in the soil. Another way is, you can see on the left side you have a potato, basically a harvester or lifter. So what that does, if you can see there, is that goes in the ground underneath the bed, and there's a chain, a kind of an elevator chain that rolls there that kind of bounces a little bit, and what it does is it helps to shake the soil off and get soil clods out of the out between the potatoes. And then in this case, this small one actually just lays the potatoes right on the surface of the ground. Works very effectively. You do still have to do what you see on the very far right, which is go back through and pick them up. But these are both some options that these two implements can really help you, because it will save you a lot of work of trying to dig them, and generally speaking, if you get them set right, they do a pretty good job of not causing any injury to those tubers. All right, next, storage. So new potatoes do not store or keep nearly as long as those that are harvested at full maturity. So you're going to want to dig new potatoes as you need them for, say, a local market, and wait until later in the season to actually dig the full season crop that you want to store. For long-term storage, you also have some variability by variety. And you can find a lot of indications on this in catalogs and magazines. Kennebec and Red Lesotho are two that are very good storage potatoes. So those are some really good options to have as far as some that will store. You'll notice if you grow different ones that there are some of them that will sprout very quickly and just do not store. And a lot of that has nothing to do with what you did. It's just the nature of the variety. Short-term storage. Any place that's dark and moderately cool. Right after harvest, I've used say an area in a shed or barn. I tend to like to put them in something like, say, on a wooden floor or in burlap sacks, so that way they don't sweat should it get to be warm or cold and get moisture. That would be in comparison to, say, like a concrete floor. If you put them out directly on where the temperature differences could cause some sweat to develop, and that could cause some storage issues. And it doesn't have to be necessarily super cool, especially at short term. Often I'll put them out in September time in a shed in an area that is completely dark. That you do want, because you'll get greening if they are not completely dark. And it may be just as a shady condition to help the skin toughen up a little bit, and also it tends, if you do have a few that won't keep, sometimes it's nice to give a few weeks for them to cure, and those that aren't going to keep will tend to, you'll notice that within a couple of weeks, and then when you go through and sort them for longer term storage, you're getting rid of a lot of those that are going to potentially rot on you otherwise. So it's typical to have a small percentage that you'll get a few that rot that maybe weren't as high a quality as others. So that is something normal. And short-term storage helps to sort some of those out. Long-term, around 35 to 40 degrees and very high humidity. This can be done in coolers, root cellars. There's the old method with storage pits, and you can see this is a example of a drawing of a storage pit. And basically in that case, you're just you're digging a pit, either a mound or a pit. You're laying straw down all the way around your tubers and then covering it with soil as an insulator, and then you will keep potatoes will keep fairly well in that environment. All right, marketing. So one thing to know is make sure that you know what your market will support. So purple potatoes are just really neat, but if no one buys them and you have a truckload of them, then that might not be quite so neat any longer. So what you can do with that is educate your consumers about new varieties. Provide them with recipes, pictures, or if you have an extra one, cut it open so they can see that an all blue potato is actually a purplish blue color inside. Provide some samples. This doesn't necessarily have to be, you can go through the procedures to have maybe a pre-cooked sample. However, maybe just if you have a lot of something or tried something new, send 1 or 2 tubers home with someone whenever they make a purchase and say, hey, try these the next time you make potatoes and see what you think. It's a very small token, but if they once get a taste for them and actually realize what they are, it'd be a good way to catch people's interest. And one thing I've noted, bigger is not always better. So oftentimes you'll find consumers that want tubers that they can cook whole or easily wash up, and not they don't want a big one that they can peel and boil and other things. Or if they want a baking potato, they don't want a large potato, which was always news to me as growing potatoes for really all of my life. I was always really excited when I had that 2 or 3 pound potato. However, not everyone is as excited as I am when you get to the marketing side. So feel out your markets and know, look at all the variety information and production techniques and things to help give you what you need for your market. And in my experience, locally grown potatoes often have a superior eating quality compared to many of these store-bought bag potatoes. We're raising some different varieties. They're also fresh. A lot of times potatoes do get stored in the commercial markets for long periods of time. So it's, in my experience, if you had people that really love potatoes and they get a hold of some of these, it's very easy to get repeat customers because they really do like the taste for, no matter what it is, baking, boiling, mashed potatoes, any kind of dish like that. They really do have some really good characteristics. So, a little bit more about marketing. So, typically, there's some different ways that we sell potatoes by. You can sell them per hundredweight, which is just 100 pounds of weight. This is typically what you'd find on a wholesale market. So, on big wholesale markets, that's the units that you'll be hearing about. By a bushel or by the pound is very common. A bushel of potatoes is 60 pounds. So that's something that is commonly used, maybe in a retail market, or maybe where you're wholesaling to local stores that don't want hundredweights. You could sell by the bushel, or at farmers markets, maybe a family wants to buy a bushel to keep for the season, or a lot of times we just sell them by the pound. Also, if you don't have a certified scale for selling at farmers markets, people will sell them in quarter pint, what I would call like a berry container or something like that, and they'll market them accordingly as a given quantity, and say you buy whatever in that that small box, rather than necessarily listing it per pound. And next, these are just a few average average price numbers. And the farmers market prices are from some farmers market price reporting project we had conducted here in Illinois for the last year. And this is just a rough average in retail situations, anywhere from around 75 cents to $2 a pound. Was fairly common, on up to, we saw up to $3 a pound. Now, granted, what I don't have to go with this data is the type of potatoes that would be. So if it was a fingerling, that could certainly warrant some of these higher prices, and also depends on your market. We have markets from anywhere from far southern Illinois to the Chicago area that were being sampled. So obviously that also influences the price that you can get. But on average, I would say the average price in that $1 to $2 per pound is fairly common. Wholesale prices, like if you're selling to local stores, I would say anywhere from 40 cents to $1 a pound, or somewhere around 24 to probably 60 pounds a bushel would be kind of a common range, or approximate range. Of course, that's all dependent on your markets and what works in your specific environment. So, to kind of follow up here are two really good resources, and these links will be up here, and you can certainly look at them in the archive version as well. One is the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide, or ID 56. These are also readily accessible as PDFs online. You can also Google either one of these and very easily come up with it. This one has very good basic cropping practices, pest management, and pesticide information. So any products that I referred to, or time to make an application, that is a really good way to get specifics on rates, how to use it properly, and and so if you that's one good place to look. The other, that I had mentioned, is the University of Kentucky Commercial Vegetable Production Guide, which is noted as number ID 36, and the link is there. You can also Google ID 36 and it comes up very quickly. Has those great recommendations for soil fertility. You can find a lot of really specific phosphorus and potassium recommendations specific to your soil test reading, so that can give you the recommendations you need to tailor your fertilizer appropriately. It also has really good information on cropping practices, and the same pest management and pest information as well. So overall, I think potatoes are a great crop to add diversity for local markets. Um, and they are fairly easy to grow. I think they can grow in diverse environments. Um, so you don't have to have that perfect sandy soil in Idaho to make potatoes work. We can certainly do it in southern Illinois and other surrounding Midwestern environments. A lot of them are fairly easy to store. Some of them may be easy to store for a couple weeks, or in some cases store for even longer. But unlike many crops, you don't have to have a cooler to store them for a month or two, or things like that, as you would maybe a more perishable crop, like say greens or things like that. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for unique and specialty markets. So you have opportunities to get some of these unique colors and varieties and things that are different than what you can typically find at a local supermarket. So you automatically have a competitive edge because you're not comparing, apples to apples in a certain sense. You have your typical potatoes that are out there, but you have a whole different set of varieties that you have opportunity to use that most of these other markets don't ever see. So it's a great way to push that, and I think there's a lot of emphasis. I know I've seen things like fingerling potatoes offered far more in restaurants and promoted on utilizing for cooking and various things. So I think there's a lot of great opportunities there. So with that, I'll wrap up. There's my feel free to contact me. There's my address and email address and telephone number there, and we appreciate you guys all listening. And with that, I know there's a few questions there that I will entertain. I didn't want to get too detracted in case someone needed to take off. But if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type them in. And I did see a couple of them. There may be a few that are buried a little deeper in the conversation. One was on potato diggers. Bronwyn mentioned to Google potato diggers. There's all kinds of potato diggers out there in various companies. You can, from the perspective of just a middle buster plow, you can even find some basic ones of those at just local farm supply stores. And from there, once you get into some of the specialty equipment markets, there's all kinds of different suppliers that have anything from a relatively small version that I showed, that little lifter with the PTO drive elevator on it, to ones that get larger from there. Wireworms in alfalfa. Wireworms are not as big a ground. They're a problem after alfalfa. Wireworms tend to like grass. So if you had any grass, or if it was a mixture in there, even a heavy infestation of grass weeds in some areas, that can be fairly problematic. But overall, there are things like some of your cereal grains or corn are things that they tend to really be problematic if you come in with potatoes after that. Yes.
Can you go back to the slide number 2? There was somebody that would like to take a screenshot of that first slide.
All right. Were there any other questions that I missed out on here? All right, we have a question. I talked about wireworms. As far as German butterball potatoes, an internal brown rot or heat necrosis. Some of these varieties, you will get that. You will get some internal discolorations. I'm not completely familiar with exactly what you're seeing. But if you ever have any pictures and want to send it to myself or one of the other colleagues, or wherever you're at, maybe a local extension person, we can certainly try to do our best to help out on that. As far as just general practices, if heat is in suspect, using straw can help to keep the soil cooler. Making sure to plant them maybe fairly plant them timely and then harvest them timely. Don't let them sit out in the soil after the vines are dying down. That can be a few things to consider. But if you have specific issues, feel free to take some shots and pass those on to us. Some best practices for growing potatoes indoors. I will say that I have not had a great deal of experience growing them inside. Ryan, are you talking about in a high tunnel situation or greenhouse? Let me know on that, and I'll try to field that. Stan, Hollow Heart. A lot of times this can be varietal. Yukon Gold is one. I don't know what variety you had seen it in. Yukon Gold can be specifically prone to Hollow Heart. Sometimes the flow of consistent supplies of water and nutrients can also have some issues with that, but some of it can be varietal and then kind of environmental conditions on top of that. Champagne, guys, you have a difference between basic potatoes and sweet potatoes. Not to get into too much, there is a great deal of difference. While both grow underground, for sweet potatoes, you're planting a slip or a portion of a stem, and you do some hilling and other things, but sweet potatoes grow a little differently. They are actually the roots, and they're not modified stems. So there are some similarities, but there are also some distinct differences, and so that's there's a lot of commonalities, although we tend to plant sweet potatoes later in the season than we do white potatoes. Sweet potatoes are definitely a warm season crop that thrives in the heat of the summer. A lot of our white or Irish potatoes tend to do better in more modest climates, and that's why we plant them earlier and tend to harvest them midsummer. All right, Ryan, so inside the house. I don't have any experience with growing them inside a house. They tend to be, you would want to have obviously a media for them to grow into of some kind. I'm sure you could probably do it in some form, maybe hydroponically, maybe in perlite or something. You would definitely need lots of light. I would fear that they would probably get kind of leggy and tend to get a little bit overgrown and not be a very staunch plant. But I don't have any necessary specific experience beyond that in maybe some of those, say, hydroponic type systems that maybe would be beneficial. So, and I'm going to briefly go back to that last page with our resources. All right, there it is for those of you that wanted that. With that, if there's no other questions, I really appreciate you guys being on today, and hope that hope you enjoyed this webinar. And feel free to contact me if you have any further questions.